Hey friends, Tommy LeFan here with the Fredericksburg Church of Christ. Thank you for listening. Have you ever felt like the world was falling apart? Like everything not nailed down was coming loose? COVID-19 has brought widespread fear upon the world. We're battling an invisible foe, and one that's not wearing the uniform of an enemy nation or shooting ammo from an assault weapon, but one that is slowly and steadily working its way through the world and bringing nations to their knees. And anytime we face an imposing enemy or an impending danger of any kind, there are two basic responses. One is fear, and that's pretty typical. A lot of people have adopted Charlie Brown's perspective on life. In one comic strip, he said, "I have a new philosophy. I only dread one day at a time." And actually, that might be an improvement for some people because fear and anxiety are rarely satisfied with one day at a time. Here's the deal. Staying calm does not mean you never experience anxiety. It simply means learning to manage it. And one good way to do that is just by recognizing what's happening within you. And so here are some common feelings that people are experiencing right now. Number one, loneliness. I don't have anyone alongside me now, and nobody really knows what I think or feel today. Number two, depression. I feel lifeless, unmotivated, flat. Number three, powerlessness. What am I going to do if this virus continues to spread? And what will my future look like? Number four, isolation. I really miss normal life. I miss my church family, my friends, and my coworkers. Number five, loss. I'm worried about how much I lost in my retirement account. I was about to retire. Now what am I going to do? And then number six, fear. I'm scared. It seems like everything is out of control. And I think that describes how a lot of people are feeling right now. And it's helpful to acknowledge your anxiety and to recognize how you tend to respond to it, because you can't address what you won't acknowledge. So acknowledge your fear and turn it over to God. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7 says, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." And see, that's the second response to the threat of danger, and it's the only one that's really helpful. Trust God because he loves you and cares for you. I want to share with you one of my favorite Psalms. It was written at a time when the people of God faced a very clear and present danger. A time when everything seemed to be going wrong, when the world seemed to be coming unglued, and there seemed to be no hope. But then God stepped in, and he came to the rescue. So I invite your attention to Psalm chapter 46. You can listen to me as I read, or better yet, follow along and read with me. Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. Though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar. Kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice. The earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see the works of the Lord, the desolations that he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow, shatters the spear, and burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Most scholars agree that this psalm was written at a time when Jerusalem was spared from the Assyrians in 701 BC. And at that time, the Assyrians were a dominating world power, taking over the entire Middle East. Nation after nation fell before them, and the only major nation that remained for Assyria to subdue was Egypt. And so the king of Assyria headed straight for Egypt. But smack dab in the middle of his path was the southern kingdom of Judah. And so the Assyrians swept into the land with an army of over 200,000, and they leveled 46 different cities on their way to Jerusalem. And then the king of Assyria sent a note to the king of Judah saying, Jerusalem is next. And so one dark day, he led his forces up to the walls of Jerusalem. They set up camp and prepared for the attack. Now imagine the fear in the hearts of the people as an enemy was on their doorstep, ready to destroy them. Imagine you turn on your TV and the announcer says, America has been invaded. Foreign troops have destroyed our armies. They're 10 miles away and they're marching toward our city. I mean, put yourself in the place of these people as their world came unglued. In their minds, there was no hope. But that night, God stepped in, and an angel of the Lord swept through the enemy's camp, and a terrible plague struck. And the next morning, 185,000 corpses lay on the ground. And so the king of Assyria tucked tail, and like a scalded dog, he ran all the way home. And it was this type of setting that caused the psalmist to write, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in time of trouble. And maybe as you look around the world today, you can't escape the feeling that our world is in trouble and that it seems as though it's coming apart at the seams. There's a new boogeyman out there, and he's out to get us, and he's coming after us, and he is no respecter of persons. He can strike or attack anyone, anytime, at any place. And that's what makes this virus so scary. You know, when a threat is gradually approaching, it tends to be more frightening than if it were to appear all of a sudden. At first, we heard media reports from China, which seemed very distant to us and not a particular threat. But then, over the course of several weeks and months, it began encroaching and getting closer and closer to home. And now it's in our own backyard. It's right here in Gillespie County. It's on our own doorstep. And as it expands, who knows who it will touch next? The fact is, it's already touched many of us in a multiplicity of ways. Social distancing, isolation, disruption of our daily routines. You know, it's like we're under siege by an invading enemy. And we're doing everything we can to protect our family, our finances, our future, and even our own physical health from COVID-19. But many of the things that we've relied on in the past offer no real protection. Well, long ago, the people of Jerusalem faced a similar threat. They'd been depending on the walls of their city. They'd been depending on the strength of their army. And as the Assyrians came, one by one, their defenses were stripped away until they stood there face to face with the enemy. There was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. I sometimes wonder if God strips away our defenses to cause us to realize that He and He alone is our only refuge. We may be depending on our families as our refuge. We may be depending on our mates as our refuge. We may be depending on the church we attend as our refuge. We may be depending on our health and our own physical strength as our refuge. We may be depending on our jobs and the security they afford as our refuge. But every one of these can be stripped away in an instant, and we'll stand there defenseless. And when that happens, we better understand this basic truth. It is God who is our refuge. God, the mighty one, the great one, the powerful one. He is our defender. He is our refuge, and He always has been. I mean, go back as far as you want in human history, and God has always been a refuge and strength to those in trouble. And anticipate as far as you wish into the future, and God will always be a refuge and strength to those in trouble. We have an all-powerful God. I mean, He has all the heavenly host at His disposal. With the snap of His finger, He can command 10,000 people to come, 10,000 angels to come to our rescue. And so He has power and control over all things, including this coronavirus. God is almighty. That's who He is. And the psalmist really believed that. And so he believed that God is our refuge, number one, because of His person. Secondly, the psalmist believed God is our refuge because of His protection. two words are used to indicate the protection that God has for us. The first word, refuge, refers to a hiding place, a secure place, a shelter. And that's who God is. He's a shelter. He's the quiet place that we can go to calm our restless hearts. The second word the psalmist used is strength. Now, refuge speaks of defensive protection, while strength speaks of offensive protection. I mean, the fact is, we can't remain hunkered down in our protective cocoon for 24 hours a day. Sooner or later, we have to get out and face life. And when we do, God will give us the strength we need to face the challenges of life. He is our refuge because of his person, because of his protection. Third, the psalmist believed that God is our refuge because of his presence, his omnipresence. You notice the last phrase of verse 1. He is an ever-present help in time of trouble. Have you ever gone to a store, say Lowe's or Home Depot, and you looked for a salesperson to help you only to discover that no help was available? And so you push the help button, and suddenly an announcement blares out to every corner of the store, help needed in plumbing, help needed in plumbing. And so you sit there waiting patiently thinking, well, the call has gone out, and so surely help is on the way. And so you wait and wait. And after waiting for what seems like an eternity, no help arrives. And so you push the button again. And again, the call blares out throughout the store, help needed in plumbing, help needed in plumbing. And you know that help is somewhere in the store, but it's not a very present help. It's not a help that is readily found. I want you to know something about God. God's not like that. He is an ever-present help in times of trouble. He'll be there. You don't have to look for him. You don't have to search for God. If you ever find yourself in a tight spot, regardless of where that may be, you can know with full assurance that God is right there with you. He is an ever-present help. Ever-present means very present. And these words emphasize two things. First, they emphasize the availability of God. He's always available because he's always present. Second, they emphasize the sufficiency of God because he is able to handle all of our problems. He is all sufficient. And so he is an ever-present help in times of trouble. Now, that doesn't mean we always recognize his presence. And it doesn't mean we always utilize his strength, but it does mean we always have access to him because he is always available. He is always present with us. An atheist was trying to transfer his unbelief to his children, and so he wrote on a marker board, God is nowhere. But he got the W in where a little too close to the O in no. And so when he asked his son to read what he wrote, he actually read it as, God is now here. God is now here. And that's what the psalmist wants you to know. He is here in times of trouble. He's right here with you. Early American Indians used to train young braves by teaching them how to fish, to hunt, and scout. And when a boy turned 13, he was given a final test. He was led blindfolded into the forest and left in the middle of the thick woods to spend the night alone. Until then, he'd never been away from the safety of his family or the tribe. It was a terrifying experience. I mean, every time a twig snapped, he visualized a wild beast ready to devour him. Well, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, dawn broke and he took off his blindfold. And he looked around and he saw the flowers, the trees, and an outline of a path. And then to his amazement, he saw the figure of a man standing just a few feet away, armed with a bow and arrow. It was his father, and he'd been there all night. That's God. He is our refuge. And because of his omnipresence, he's constantly with us and watching over us. Notice verses 2 and 3 of the passage. He says, therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roam and roar and foam, and the mountains quake with their surging. And here, Here the psalmist is trying to describe the indescribable. He's describing how he felt whenever the Assyrians came up to the wall of Jerusalem. And he described for all generations how we feel when it seems our world is coming apart. Two things we think of as immovable. One, the earth. The earth is firm. We refer to it as the terra firma because it is firm. Secondly, the mountains. They're fixed. They seem to be permanent. They were here yesterday, and we expect them to be here tomorrow. But what happens to the earth and the mountains in this psalm? See, the earth begins to shake, and the mountains begin to slide into the sea. Ocean waves dash against the mountains, and the peaks begin to crumble like sandcastles on the seashore. The world is coming unglued, and yet the psalmist says, we will not fear. Those are strong words. How many fearless people do you really know? It seems like they're few and far between. It reminds me of a man's fiercely independent grandmother, 84-year-old grandmother. She lived in the old family home. Her 4 children lived in the same town, but she rarely called them except in case of emergency. And so when one of her sons got a call from her one morning, he immediately drove over to her house. And when he got there, she explained that she had heard noises in the night and suspected that there was a burglar in her bedroom closet. Exasperated, the son said, well, why didn't you call me last night? To which she replied, well, it was late and I didn't want to bother you, so I just nailed the door shut and I went to bed. That's the kind of confidence we can have when we know that God is with us. We nail the closet door shut and we let him take care of things because God is with us. He's watching over us and he'll never leave us. The psalmist said, God is our refuge. We will not fear. So life-altering events like COVID-19 can threaten to change the landscape of our lives, and yet we don't have to be fearful or afraid. We don't have to worry. I recently read about a little animal called the rock badger. And if you don't know what that is, just imagine a guinea pig with small ears and a tail. These little critters can be found all over Africa and the Middle East. And they make their home in the rocky areas that provide a place of escape and protection from predators. And their natural grayish color provides some camouflage against the backdrop of the rocks. And when a predator comes, they just run into a gap or a cleft in the rock. And if a bird of prey wants to snack on them, they got to catch the badgers before they reach the rocks. And in the rocks, they're safe. But the farther from the rocks the badger ventures, the more vulnerable it becomes. I mean, it doesn't matter how courageous the little badger is or how fast he thinks he is. This little badger is no match for a ferocious predator. Fortunately, the badger is wise enough to know that his strength does not lie in what he can do, but in what the mountain shelter can do for him. He knows where to run. And my friend, we have a rock or a shelter that we can run to in times of trouble. We will not fear because we have a God who invites us to take shelter in him. Verse 4 begins with, there is a river. And here the scene shifts from chaos to calm because the psalmist says there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. The city of God in those days was, of course, Jerusalem. And the writer pictured a stream flowing through the heart of the city. And what's interesting about this is that Jerusalem was one of the few ancient cities that was not built on a river. And that's unusual because ancient cities needed water close at hand, especially during a siege. But years before the Assyrians threatened, King Hezekiah wisely carved an underground tunnel, 1,800 feet deep, cut through solid rock, and he diverted the water from the Gihon Springs into a reservoir inside the city walls. See, back in those days when an army wanted to capture a city, they would surround it and then try to starve out the inhabitants. But a city could hold off their enemies as long as they had a source of water. And oftentimes that water would come from wells. But the water in those wells would eventually run dry. And when that happened, when the water ran out, the city was in big trouble. But if the city had a source of running water, like a river, they could last a long time. And that river not only satisfied their thirst, but it also filled them with hope, joy, and security. That's what God provided for the citizens of Jerusalem. He was a spring of living water, filling them with gladness and joy, even in the midst of their trouble. He gave them what they needed. Now, imagine the people of Jerusalem as they looked down at the campfires of the Assyrians, wondering when the army would attack and destroy them. Can you imagine how they must have felt? They were as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Finally, they go to bed, but they couldn't sleep. They tossed and they turned all night long, and early the next morning, they got up and they returned to the walls and they looked down again. Well, the campfires had died down. There was no movement. When the sun finally rose, they saw the dead bodies of their enemy. When the morning finally dawned, they could see that God had indeed helped them. He was their help at break of day. Why? Because God can do anything. Reminds me of a little 5-year-old boy who was waiting for his parents after Bible class, and the preacher saw him standing there. He decided to quiz him to determine how much the children were learning. And so he said, "Young man, if you can tell me something God can do, I'll give you a big, shiny apple." To which the little boy replied, "Preacher, if you can tell me something God can't do, I'll give you a whole box of apples." And the point is, God can do anything. Anything is possible for him. He can defeat this virus just like he defeated the Assyrian army. Verses 6 and 7 say, nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice and the earth melts. And imagine being an Israelite looking down from the wall at the Assyrian camp after the Lord had visited it. Can you picture that scene in your mind's eye? Verses 8 and 9, the psalmist says, "Come and see what the Lord has done, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow, shatters the spear, and burns the shields with fire." See, that's what God did for the people of Jerusalem. He gave them victory over their enemies. Now, question, can you see any application for us today? I mean, God makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. Think about the wars we fight. Wars against evil, wars against enemy nations, wars against sickness and disease. Can God work in all of these? Absolutely. He makes wars to cease. In verse 10, God said, "I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." God's going to be victorious, and he can make us victorious as well. Now, you've probably heard the last part of verse 10 before. "Be still and know that I am God." One of the benefits of this coronavirus is that it's causing a lot of people to be still right now, whether they want to or not. It's causing a lot of people to reflect on their own mortality. And sometimes we forget that, and we need to be reminded of that. The psalmist said in Psalm 90 and verse 12, "Lord, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom." None of us are going to live forever. And so the best time to prepare for our upcoming death is now. Don't look too far into the future. Stay in the moment. And remember the two laws of being a surgeon. Number one, there is a God. And number two, you're not him. And so during this unprecedented time, let me encourage you to take advantage of this Sabbath rest and be still and remember that God is still God. He is still on the throne. He is still sovereign and Lord of this universe. He knew that this virus was going to happen long before it ever came on the scene. He wasn't caught off guard or surprised by it. And so question, do you think that the God who rules over his creation, who speaks the word and can cause an entire army to drop dead, do you think he is sufficient for your problems? Absolutely. And by the way, did you notice that the psalmist referred to God as the God of Jacob? You remember Jacob, the Old Testament? Who was Jacob? Well, he was not a very good guy. He was really a scoundrel and a schemer, a chiseler, and a cheat. He took advantage of people most of his life. And the point is, God saves us because of his goodness, not because of ours. Jacob was far from perfect. just like you. But the good Lord is even the God of Jacob, and his help in time of trouble is not conditioned upon our great strength, but upon his great grace. And so when you are insufficient, which is always, depend upon the Lord of hosts, the God of Jacob, who is our refuge. Be still and know that he is God, that he loves you, and that he can take care of you. Stay Hill Country strong.